Sophia Bryant had never been a person prone to sentimentality. As a practicing real estate attorney with 15 years under her belt, she understood better than most that property was, at its core, a matter of cold contracts, boundaries on a map, and signatures on paper. Still, when her father passed away the previous year, leaving her a sizable parcel of undeveloped land just outside the affluent suburban enclave of Maple Ridge, something about the inheritance tugged at her in a way she hadn't expected. The land, a sprawling 6-acre plot once used as pasture, had sat idle for decades, a green wedge of forgotten space tucked between newer luxury homes that seemed determined to erase every trace of the area's agricultural past. Her father, always pragmatic, had refused numerous offers from developers, believing the land would be more valuable untouched. And now it was hers. At first, Sophia had no clear plan for the property. Life in the city was demanding, and her practice consumed most of her energy. But as the months passed, the thought of finally putting the land to use grew more compelling. After all, in a market like this, such a parcel was a rare asset, and with the right permits, a boutique rental property or even a small commercial venture could yield significant returns. When she finally decided to move forward, Sophia approached the project with the same rigor she brought to every case. She requested updated surveys, researched local zoning ordinances, and initiated the process of obtaining a building permit for a multi-unit residence. But from the outset, things began to feel off. The first surveyor she contacted, a seasoned professional she trusted, returned with an oddly worded report. According to his findings, there was an encroachment along the northern edge of the parcel. The issue was not minor. A substantial structure, namely the sprawling 3-story home of one Marilyn Westbrook, president of the Maple Ridge Neighborhood Association, appeared to extend a full 25 feet over Sophia's legal boundary. The surveyor, an old colleague, called her directly after filing the report. "Sophia, I don't want to alarm you," he'd said, his voice edged with discomfort. "But it looks like that house is planted on your land. Not just a fence or a patio. Part of the foundation." Sophia felt a chill run through her, but her instincts as an attorney kicked in immediately. She thanked the surveyor and scheduled an appointment with the County Land Records Office. There, she pulled the chain of title on her property and cross-referenced the parcel maps going back 40 years. The evidence was clear and damning. Her father's property line had never changed, and no easement or agreement existed that would permit any structure from the adjacent lot to cross into it. Legally, part of Marilyn Westbrook's house sat squarely on Sophia's land. It was not a gray area. It was trespass, plain and simple. Still, Sophia knew better than to jump into confrontation without preparation. She spent the next week assembling a bulletproof packet of documentation, certified surveys, title history, municipal zoning maps, and notarized statements. Only when she was fully prepared did she reach out to Marilyn, requesting a meeting. They met not in a coffee shop or someone's living room, but in a neutral, public space, the county registrar's building, where both could access any official records as needed. Sophia was calm and professional, dressed in her usual sharp suit, her tone measured and polite. Marilyn arrived later than agreed, flanked by 2 members of her board, her usual air of superiority firmly in place. At first, the conversation was civil. Sophia presented the survey findings and her historical documents, explaining that the encroachment was a serious issue that needed to be addressed. As Marilyn scanned the papers, Sophia saw the woman's expression shift, from bored condescension to something darker. Her face drained of color. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the notarized documents. Then, without warning, she shoved the packet aside, stood abruptly, and began shouting. "This is harassment! You're threatening me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing across the tiled lobby. Before Sophia could respond, Marilyn whipped out her phone and dialed 911 on speaker. "There's a woman here threatening me in the registrar's office," she cried theatrically. "I'm in fear for my safety." The scene was surreal. Several clerks and bystanders looked on in shock. Sophia remained rooted, refusing to be baited, knowing full well that the entire incident was being recorded by security cameras. Within minutes, 2 local deputies arrived. They quickly assessed the situation, spoke with witnesses, and after reviewing the documents Sophia calmly provided, determined there was no criminal conduct whatsoever. The deputies, clearly annoyed at being used for a personal vendetta, filed a report noting that no threat had been made and advised Marilyn to pursue any civil concerns through proper legal channels. Sophia left the building with her professional composure intact, but internally she was seething. Marilyn's panicked reaction wasn't just the overblown response of an entitled neighborhood leader, it reeked of deeper fear. Why would a woman so accustomed to wielding power resort to theatrics unless she knew something was fundamentally wrong? Sophia suspected this was more than a simple boundary dispute. That suspicion deepened the next morning when a hand-delivered letter arrived at her office. Not from the association, but from a law firm with no clear connection to Maple Ridge. The letter was oddly informal, couched in vaguely conciliatory language, offering to explore a mutually agreeable resolution regarding recent property concerns, and enclosed a generous gift card to an upscale spa in the city. No sender name was given beyond a generic managing counsel. The entire tone of the letter suggested an under-the-table attempt to buy her silence or at least dissuade her from pursuing the matter further. Sophia's instincts sharpened. This was not a random encroachment. Someone, somewhere, had a lot to lose if the full truth came to light. And so, while maintaining her usual caseload at the firm, Sophia quietly began laying the groundwork for a more comprehensive inquiry. She retained an independent land use expert and requested a forensic review of the subdivision's original planning documents. Meanwhile, whispers began circulating through the neighborhood. Vague, anxious conversations overheard at council meetings and civic events. Some residents now avoided eye contact when Sophia passed. Others greeted her with strained politeness. It was clear the news had begun to spread, and equally clear that some parties were desperate to contain it. But Sophia Bryant was not about to be intimidated. She had built her career on dissecting precisely these kinds of cases, on knowing when a paper trail led to something far bigger than anyone wanted to admit. And the deeper she dug, the more certain she became. The house on her land was merely the surface of a much wider, much dirtier story. One that, soon enough, she intended to bring fully into the light. Sophia had anticipated some level of pushback from Marilyn, perhaps even legal posturing, but she hadn't expected such blatant theatrics. The fact that the woman had resorted to a false 911 call told Sophia more than any legal argument ever could. Marilyn knew she was on shaky ground. That made Sophia even more determined to press forward, but unlike her adversary, she would do so through proper channels, with ironclad evidence and methodical preparation. First, she contacted her trusted surveyor again and requested a second, fully notarized report, this time formatted specifically for submission in court should it come to that. She also began reaching out to an independent title research firm, not one of the local outfits that often worked closely with developers, but a firm with a reputation for forensic-level detail. Something about the entire situation smelled of a larger scheme, and if Marilyn's house was sitting on Sophia's land, it was unlikely to be an isolated case of poor measurement. Meanwhile, Sophia's inbox and voicemail began to fill with curious, and in some cases thinly veiled, hostile inquiries from members of the Neighborhood Association Board. The tone varied. Some were patronizing, others vaguely threatening, all under the guise of seeking clarification about her intentions. She responded to none of them directly. Instead, she forwarded the communications to her personal attorney, a seasoned litigator named Mark Givens, who specialized in property law and had handled several high-profile land disputes in the past. Mark reviewed the situation carefully and agreed that Sophia had a strong legal position, but he also cautioned that things were unlikely to remain civil. In cases where large sums of money and property values were at stake, emotions ran high and tactics often turned ugly. It was sound advice. Within days of the incident at the registrar's office, Sophia noticed a subtle but undeniable shift in her environment. Her usual coffee shop visits were now met with strained smiles. Conversations in public spaces would go quiet when she entered. Neighbors who previously greeted her with warmth now seemed wary or cold. And then came the first overt move. A certified letter delivered to her office, this time from an obscure legal firm representing concerned property owners within the Maple Ridge community. The letter was heavy on rhetoric, but light on substance. It accused Sophia of attempting to disrupt community harmony, of threatening the peaceful enjoyment of neighboring properties, and warned that further actions on her part could result in legal action for harassment and damages. Sophia immediately recognized the letter for what it was, a bluff designed to intimidate and discourage her from pursuing her rightful claim. But it also confirmed another suspicion. A coordinated effort was now underway to isolate her and to apply pressure through both social and legal channels. She instructed Mark to draft a formal reply, rejecting the accusations and reminding the senders that her actions were entirely lawful and backed by documented evidence. While the legal maneuvering unfolded, the independent title researchers Sophia had engaged began their deep dive into the original subdivision records. What they found was startling. Early records from the county's archives indicated that several parcels within Maple Ridge, including the lot on which Marilyn's house stood, had been subject to a boundary adjustment process during the initial phase of development. The adjustment, however, had been poorly documented, with inconsistencies between the original plat maps and the versions later submitted for municipal approval. In short, it appeared that the developers had smoothed over certain irregularities in lot boundaries to fit their desired layout, likely assuming no one would notice. It was a gamble that had worked, until now. As this information came to light, Sophia directed her focus toward the next logical step, protecting herself from further escalation. On Mark's advice, she filed a formal notice of her property claim with the county, ensuring that any subsequent transactions involving adjacent lots would trigger a disclosure requirement. It was a strategic move that forced the association and any prospective buyers to confront the legal reality of the situation. Moreover, it protected Sophia from potential bad faith transfers or fraudulent adjustments designed to undermine her claim. Meanwhile, Marilyn remained conspicuously silent. After the dramatic scene at the registrar's office, she had withdrawn from public appearances. She missed 2 consecutive association board meetings and declined to answer direct inquiries from other board members. Rumors swirled. Some suggested she was consulting with high-powered attorneys. Others speculated she was negotiating a quiet settlement. But Sophia doubted Marilyn would go down quietly. More likely, the woman was regrouping and preparing her next move. That move came in an unexpected form. One afternoon, as Sophia returned to her office after court, she was met by a pair of men waiting near her building's entrance. They were dressed in casual business attire, neither carrying visible identification, but both projecting an unmistakable air of calculated professionalism. They introduced themselves as consultants representing interested parties in the Maple Ridge community, and requested a few minutes of her time. Sophia, wary but composed, agreed, outside in plain view of the busy downtown street. The men wasted little time. Their message was blunt. It would be in everyone's best interest if the matter of the boundary dispute were resolved quietly. They suggested that a generous settlement could be arranged if Sophia were willing to withdraw her claim and allow the current property lines to stand as they were. When Sophia asked who exactly they represented, The men deflected with vague language about stakeholders and long-standing community interests. It was clear they were not from the association directly, nor were they acting under any official legal authority. They were fixers, hired to make problems disappear. Sophia's response was equally clear. Without raising her voice or betraying emotion, she informed them that any further contact of this nature would be documented and treated as evidence of attempted coercion. She then wished them good day and walked into her office, leaving the men to retreat under the gaze of passing pedestrians. Inside, she immediately called Mark and detailed the encounter. He advised her to draft a sworn affidavit of the incident and to notify law enforcement, not necessarily to file charges, but to create an official record in case the situation escalated further. It was a prudent step, and one Sophia took without hesitation. At this point, the pattern was undeniable. Forces well beyond Marilyn herself were now invested in containing the fallout from Sophia's discovery. The boundary issue was not merely a private dispute between neighbors. It was the tip of a much larger, much more complex problem rooted in the very foundation of Maple Ridge's development. And Sophia, by virtue of her training and tenacity, was uniquely positioned to expose it. But, as determined as she was, Sophia also understood the stakes had risen sharply. What had begun as a simple property claim was fast becoming a battle against entrenched interests with significant resources at their disposal. It would require not just legal expertise, but strategic foresight and personal resolve to see it through. And as the days grew shorter and the pressure mounted, Sophia prepared herself for the long fight ahead, knowing that the true extent of the scheme had yet to be revealed. The days following the failed intimidation attempt marked a decisive shift in the tone of the conflict. Where previously the moves against Sophia had been indirect, veiled behind polite legal language or subtle social pressure, they now grew more overt and coordinated. It began with another certified letter, this time from a new law firm. One Sophia did not recognize, based out of another county entirely, which struck her as curious. The letter, dripping with legal posturing, accused her of slander and intentional infliction of emotional distress upon the residents of Maple Ridge, citing her reckless pursuit of unfounded claims. The absurdity of the accusation was transparent to anyone familiar with the case, but it served a clear tactical purpose: to create a chilling effect and to lay groundwork for potential nuisance litigation that could tie Sophia up in court for months. Mark, after reviewing the letter, advised a carefully worded response rejecting the claims and preemptively notifying the court of the likelihood of frivolous suits being filed. This would allow them to seek sanctions against opposing counsel should such a strategy be pursued. At the same time, Sophia's office began receiving anonymous calls and emails, many laced with veiled threats or personal insults. The language suggested an organized campaign rather than random anger. IP traces on the emails led back to public networks, coffee shops, libraries, clearly an effort to obscure the senders' identities. Though none of the communications rose to the level of actionable criminal threat, they added to the growing atmosphere of hostility. Sophia remained outwardly unshaken, but Mark reminded her that it would be prudent to enhance personal security, if only as a precaution. She agreed and engaged a reputable firm to upgrade surveillance at both her office and her private residence. Meanwhile, the independent title investigators completed their initial review of the subdivision's historical records. What they uncovered confirmed Sophia's worst suspicions. The original boundary adjustments had not merely been sloppy, they had been deliberately manipulated. Several lots, including that of Marilyn's home, had been redrawn during a period when the original developer was under intense financial pressure to complete sales. The adjustments had been pushed through during a brief window when the county's land office leadership had changed, and documentation of the changes was inconsistent, with key approvals either missing or post-dated. In essence, corners had been cut, and now those shortcuts threatened to unravel an entire section of the neighborhood's legal foundation. Sophia and Mark wasted no time. They prepared a formal complaint for submission to the county's Property Oversight Board, accompanied by affidavits from the surveyor and the title experts. The complaint stopped short of outright accusing anyone of fraud. It was framed around procedural irregularities and the need for a formal investigation, but its implications were unmistakable. Once filed, the complaint became a public record, forcing the issue into official channels where it could no longer be buried quietly. The filing triggered a flurry of responses. First, a hastily convened meeting of the Maple Ridge Association Board was announced, ostensibly to discuss recent community concerns. Sophia, though technically not a voting member of the association, attended as a property owner with a vested interest. The atmosphere was tense from the outset. Several board members cast hostile glances her way as she entered. Marilyn, notably absent for weeks, now appeared, her usual confidence replaced by a brittle defensiveness. The meeting quickly devolved into a spectacle of finger-pointing and denial. Some board members insisted that the matter was a private dispute between Sophia and Marilyn, while others urged that broader legal implications be considered. It was during this chaotic meeting that another layer of the scheme surfaced. A junior board member, evidently less comfortable with the unfolding cover-up, blurted out that several properties in the north section of the subdivision were also implicated in boundary irregularities. The admission caused an immediate uproar. Marilyn attempted to gavel the meeting closed, but the damage was done. Word spread rapidly through the neighborhood. By the following morning, Sophia's office phone was ringing with calls from other residents seeking advice, some in a panic over potential title defects. Sensing the situation spiraling beyond their control, the opposing forces shifted tactics once again. Within days, Sophia was served with a civil complaint filed by one of the more vocal association members, not Marilyn, but a proxy, alleging that her actions were causing irreparable harm to property values and undue emotional distress to the community. The suit was legally flimsy but strategically clever. It sought a temporary restraining order to prevent Sophia from filing further public claims or pursuing litigation related to the land dispute. Mark immediately moved to have the case dismissed and filed a countersuit for abuse of process. But the filing forced Sophia into court for procedural hearings, consuming valuable time and resources. Simultaneously, more troubling developments emerged. The forensic title review uncovered that key documents from the original plat approval, specifically a set of easement waivers, had vanished from the county archives. The discovery was not accidental. A records clerk under oath confirmed that the documents had been present as recently as 6 months prior but were now unaccounted for. The likelihood of random misfiling was low. The timing suggested deliberate tampering. Mark advised Sophia to file an official report with the county sheriff's office documenting the disappearance as potential evidence suppression. Though the investigation would take time, it placed yet another legal cloud over the entire matter, one that could not easily be dismissed by the association's legal team. Throughout this escalating battle, Sophia remained methodical. She refused to be baited into public spats or media theatrics. She focused instead on building an unassailable legal record. Every letter, every meeting, every suspicious contact was meticulously documented. Her strategy was clear: to force her adversaries into a position where they could no longer hide behind procedural ambiguity or social intimidation. Yet, the personal toll was undeniable. Friends and professional colleagues began quietly expressing concern. Some advised her to settle, to accept a payout and walk away. But Sophia knew that doing so would not resolve the underlying fraud. It would simply bury it deeper, leaving her land rights compromised and the broader neighborhood exposed to future legal chaos. That was a risk she refused to accept, not as an attorney, and certainly not as a landowner. As the calendar turned toward the final quarter of the year, Sophia prepared for what she knew would be a prolonged legal war. The opposition had resources and influence, but Sophia had truth, law, and professional discipline on her side. And if the first phase of escalation had proven anything, it was that the deeper this conflict went, the more dangerous it became, not only for her opponents, but for the very foundations of Maple Ridge itself. The battle lines were drawn, and there would be no turning back now. By late autumn, the conflict had entered a new phase. The situation in Maple Ridge was no longer a matter of private concern between Sophia and Marilyn. It had metastasized into a community-wide crisis that no one could ignore. Property values were indeed beginning to wobble, not because of Sophia's actions, but because of the legal uncertainty now hovering over multiple parcels. Several prospective home sales had fallen through as buyers, alerted by their title insurers or by word of mouth, grew wary of investing in properties whose legal boundaries might soon be challenged in court. Meanwhile, the County Property Oversight Board, having completed its preliminary review of Sophia's formal complaint, announced that it would initiate a full audit of the original subdivision records, including the period when the boundary adjustments had been made. This audit would not be a quick process. It could take months, possibly longer. But its very initiation sent shockwaves through the development community and the higher echelons of the county administration. Developers who had long assumed that the irregularities would remain buried now faced the prospect of formal exposure. Sophia, for her part, continued her methodical approach. With Mark's guidance, she filed an additional motion in court, a petition to quiet title on her property, a legal mechanism that, if granted, would formally and conclusively establish her land boundaries in the public record, thereby protecting her rights regardless of any subsequent attempts to manipulate the historical documents. The filing was a calculated move, one that would force Maryland's legal team and the association to confront the core issue head-on. They could no longer hide behind procedural distractions or social pressure. The law would now have to speak. It was at this critical juncture that Sophia received an unexpected call from her independent title consultant. The forensic team had uncovered something new, buried deep in the archived correspondence between the original developer and the county's planning department. Among the decades-old communications was a series of internal memos suggesting that, during the subdivision's approval process, certain county officials had expressed concern about the irregular boundary adjustments. Those concerns, however, had been overridden, quietly and without proper documentation, by a senior planning officer who had since retired and taken a lucrative position with one of the region's largest real estate investment firms. The implications were profound. This was no longer just a case of sloppy record-keeping or developer negligence. It pointed to a deliberate effort to push through flawed approvals for financial gain, an effort that had been aided by elements within the county administration itself. The memos, while not outright proof of criminal conspiracy, were damning circumstantial evidence. Mark advised immediate caution. The discovery raised the stakes considerably and could provoke more aggressive countermeasures from those with the most to lose. Sophia understood the risk, but she also saw the opportunity. With Mark's help, she secured certified copies of the memos and filed them as supplemental evidence in her quiet title action. At the same time, she arranged a discreet meeting with a trusted contact in the state attorney general's office, a former colleague from her early days as a clerk who specialized in public integrity investigations. Without making formal accusations, Sophia provided an overview of the emerging evidence and suggested that the matter warranted closer scrutiny at the state level. The contact agreed to initiate a preliminary inquiry, one that could eventually lead to a broader investigation into corruption in county land approvals. As these legal and political gears began to turn, the pressure on Sophia increased. Surveillance of her office intensified. Unmarked vehicles were observed parked for hours near both her workplace and her home. Private investigators, hired by parties unknown, were now shadowing her movements. Though these tactics stopped short of outright harassment, they were clearly designed to intimidate. Sophia responded not with fear, but with strategic escalation. She brought in her own security consultants who documented the surveillance activities and compiled detailed reports for potential use in court. She also briefed local law enforcement, ensuring that any escalation would trigger an immediate and well-documented legal response. Meanwhile, the association board began to fracture under the strain. Several members, increasingly uneasy about the growing scandal and its potential legal consequences, began to distance themselves from Marilyn and the more aggressive factions. One board member resigned outright, citing irreconcilable differences over the board's handling of the boundary dispute. Others quietly reached out to Sophia's office, seeking private consultations about the potential impact on their own properties. What emerged from these back-channel conversations was a clearer picture of the internal dynamics. Marilyn, it seemed, had been the public face of the pushback, but the deeper resistance was coming from a shadow network of financial stakeholders tied to the original developer and subsequent investment interests in the neighborhood. It was a classic playbook. Use the association as a shield, keep the real players out of sight, and apply social and legal pressure to silence dissent. But now, thanks to Sophia's unrelenting strategy and the emergence of new evidence, that shield was beginning to crack. The middle point of the battle had arrived. The forces aligned against her were more exposed than ever, and the legal mechanisms were in motion that would soon bring the entire scheme into full public view. For Sophia, this was both a validation of her approach and a warning. The deeper she pushed, the more dangerous the opposition would become. Yet she remained resolute. The law was on her side, and the truth, layer by layer, was beginning to surface. There would be no turning back now, only the hard road forward toward final resolution. As winter settled over the city, the battle surrounding Sophia's property dispute escalated beyond anything she had yet experienced. The audit initiated by the county's Property Oversight Board progressed slowly, but with each passing week, new irregularities emerged. It was now evident to anyone closely following the situation that the problems with Maple Ridge's subdivision records extended well beyond Sophia's parcel and Marilyn's encroaching home. At least 7 other properties showed signs of boundary discrepancies, and 3 of them were already the subject of quiet inquiries from concerned homeowners who had been tipped off through various legal circles. The local real estate market, once among the most stable in the county, began to show signs of strain. Title insurers started flagging sales in the neighborhood for enhanced review, and several pending transactions were abruptly canceled when lenders grew wary of approving mortgages on potentially compromised lots. What had started as a private property dispute now threatened to evolve into a full-blown market scandal. The financial interests at stake were enormous, and those with the most to lose were beginning to panic. Sophia was fully aware of the implications. Mark, ever the realist, warned her that they should expect more aggressive pushback. "We've hit a nerve," he said one evening as they reviewed the latest batch of filings and responses. "They're going to get desperate. Be ready." He was right. The first wave of counterattack came in the form of an entirely new lawsuit filed against Sophia. This time not by the association or one of its members, but by a shell entity calling itself Maple Ridge Preservation Group, LLC. The suit accused Sophia of malicious interference with community affairs, intentional infliction of financial harm, and sought both injunctive relief and punitive damages. The filing was as audacious as it was hollow. The LLC had been incorporated only weeks prior and traced back to a private law firm known for fronting for undisclosed clients. Mark's team filed an immediate motion to dismiss and petition the court to compel disclosure of the true parties behind the LLC. But the message was clear. The opposition had shifted to using proxy entities to escalate legal pressure without directly exposing the core players. Simultaneously, a more insidious campaign unfolded in the court of public opinion. Anonymous flyers appeared in mailboxes throughout Maple Ridge, portraying Sophia as an opportunistic outsider bent on destroying the neighborhood's reputation and stability. The language was inflammatory, designed to incite fear and resentment. Local community forums, both online and in person, buzzed with divisive rhetoric. Some residents, understandably rattled by the uncertainty, lashed out, blaming Sophia for the turmoil. Others, however, began to voice more measured concerns, questioning why the association's leadership and the developers had allowed such a situation to fester unchecked for so long. The neighborhood was growing polarized. Sophia remained outwardly composed, but privately she recognized the strain. Friends urged her to consider settling, to take a payout if offered and walk away. But she knew too much now. Settling would not erase the systemic fraud underlying the subdivision's development, nor would it guarantee the integrity of her own land rights. Moreover, the principle of the matter had become too significant to ignore. Allowing those who had perpetrated this scheme to quietly buy their way out of accountability would only embolden further abuses. As legal filings flew back and forth, the audit reached a critical milestone. A preliminary report from the County Oversight Board, leaked through back channels to Mark's office, confirmed that the original subdivision approvals had indeed been granted based on flawed, and in some cases falsified, boundary data. The report stopped short of assigning individual culpability, but its findings would inevitably lead to deeper investigations. More importantly, the report provided a substantial evidentiary boost to Sophia's quiet title action, strengthening her case immeasurably. It was at this juncture that an unexpected ally emerged. One of the former county planning officials involved in the original subdivision approval process, a man now retired and living out of state, contacted Mark's office through an intermediary. The official, burdened by a guilty conscience and fearing legal exposure, offered to provide a sworn affidavit detailing the pressures and irregularities he had witnessed during the approval phase. After a careful vetting process, the affidavit was secured. Its contents were explosive. Explicit references to developer influence, internal objections overridden without proper procedure, and clear indications that certain boundary adjustments had been made to facilitate higher density sales, all under the guise of streamlining the approval process. With this new evidence in hand, Mark and Sophia prepared for the next phase of the litigation. They filed a motion to expedite the quiet title proceedings, citing the growing financial harm and public interest concerns. They also expanded their legal strategy to include potential claims for fraudulent conveyance and civil conspiracy, targeting not only the association's leadership, but also the developer entities and any complicit officials. Predictably, the opposition responded with heightened aggression. The Shell LLC suit was amended to include new, equally spurious claims. Anonymous harassment intensified. Sophia's office was vandalized late one night, windows broken, files rifled through, though nothing of value was taken. Security footage captured masked individuals, but identification proved difficult. The incident, while disturbing, only steeled Sophia's resolve. Law enforcement, now more attuned to the seriousness of the situation, launched a formal investigation, treating the vandalism as part of a broader pattern of intimidation linked to the property dispute. Meanwhile, cracks within the opposition began to widen. Several association board members, fearful of personal legal exposure, sought separate counsel and began quietly cooperating with the county's audit team. Leaked internal emails revealed deep divisions among the leadership, with some members openly questioning Marilyn's continued role as president. The once unified front of the association was fracturing under the weight of mounting evidence and public scrutiny. Amid this escalating turmoil, Sophia maintained her strategic focus. She continued to document every development meticulously, ensuring that her legal record remained unimpeachable. Her public statements, when necessary, were measured and factual, reinforcing her position as a disciplined legal professional rather than an agitator. Behind the scenes, her network of allies expanded. Other affected homeowners began organizing, seeking guidance from Sophia's team. Local journalists, sensing a deeper story, initiated their own investigations, though Sophia remained cautious about media involvement, preferring to let the legal process unfold without undue sensationalism. As the new year approached, the stakes could not have been higher. The legal battle had evolved into a complex, multi-front war involving private litigation, public audits, potential criminal investigations, and the very fabric of the local real estate market. Sophia stood at the center of this maelstrom, her position both precarious and powerful. The outcome of her quiet title action, now scheduled for hearing in the coming months, would not only determine the fate of her property but could trigger a cascade of legal and financial consequences across Maple Ridge and beyond. Yet amidst the uncertainty, one fact remained clear. Sophia had refused to be intimidated, refused to compromise the integrity of her claim, and in doing so had forced into the light a web of corruption that others had long sought to keep hidden. The second wave of escalation had revealed the true scale of the battle, but it had also confirmed that Sophia, armed with truth and law, was prepared to see it through to the end. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the hearing. News of the Maple Ridge scandal had spread far beyond the confines of the neighborhood, drawing reporters, legal observers, and a scattering of concerned homeowners. The stakes of Sophia's quiet title action had grown exponentially. This was no longer a simple property dispute, but a case that threatened to upend a significant swath of the county's real estate framework. Mark had warned Sophia that the opposition would make one penal, desperate attempt to derail the proceedings. And indeed, the courtroom atmosphere buzzed with tension as the various legal teams filed in. Marilyn was present, flanked by two high-profile attorneys from a prominent corporate litigation firm. Representatives from the original developer's legal counsel occupied another row, their expressions unreadable. The county itself had sent its lead land use attorney, signaling the government's recognition of the matter's gravity. And presiding over it all was Judge Harlan Green, a veteran jurist known for his unflinching approach to cases involving public corruption and land disputes. Sophia sat beside Mark at the plaintiff's table, her demeanor composed, her case meticulously prepared. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, their team had assembled an unassailable portfolio of evidence: historical survey data, certified title reports, the damning internal memos, and the retired official's sworn affidavit. They had also secured corroborating testimony from current and former county employees who had belatedly come forward once the breadth of the scandal became undeniable. The legal foundation of Sophia's claim was rock solid. The challenge lay not in the strength of her case, but in navigating the procedural traps and obfuscations the defense would inevitably deploy. The hearing began with procedural arguments. As expected, the defense sought to delay, filing a motion for continuance on the grounds of newly discovered evidence requiring further review. Judge Green, clearly unimpressed, denied the motion, citing the ample time already afforded to all parties. He then moved swiftly to the substance of the case, allowing Mark to present the core of Sophia's claim. Mark's opening argument was masterful, calm, precise, and devastatingly thorough. He traced the chain of title back to its origins, establishing the unbroken legitimacy of Sophia's ownership. He then methodically dismantled the opposition's assertions, demonstrating how the boundary discrepancies had arisen not through natural error or mutual mistake, but through deliberate manipulation of the approval process. The presentation of the retired official's affidavit drew an audible reaction from the courtroom gallery, its contents laying bare the depth of the misconduct involved. The defense countered with every tool at their disposal. They questioned the motivations of the witnesses, attempted to cast doubt on the chain of custody for key documents, and argued that the statute of limitations precluded certain aspects of Sophia's claim. But Judge Green, a former real estate litigator himself, cut through these tactics with surgical precision. he pressed the defense on specific points of law and fact, forcing them to concede ground they could not legitimately defend. As the day progressed, the tone of the hearing shifted. What had begun as a contest of legal arguments evolved into a broader reckoning with the systemic failures that had allowed such a situation to arise. The county's land use attorney, when called upon, acknowledged the procedural lapses and confirmed that the ongoing audit had uncovered significant irregularities extending beyond Sophia's parcel. The acknowledgement, though carefully phrased, validated much of what Sophia's team had contended from the outset. Then came the turning point. Midway through the proceedings, Mark introduced a previously undisclosed piece of evidence: a financial ledger recovered from a storage unit leased by one of the now-defunct shell companies linked to the original developer. The ledger contained records of payments made to various parties during the subdivision approval period, including entries suggesting improper payments to a former county planning supervisor. The revelation electrified the courtroom. The defense attorneys demanded a recess, clearly caught off guard. Judge Green granted a brief adjournment, but the damage was done. The case had now crossed from a civil property dispute into the realm of potential criminal inquiry. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere was markedly different. The defense, visibly rattled, shifted to damage control, seeking to minimize the implications of the new evidence. But it was too late. The momentum had irrevocably shifted in Sophia's favor. In his closing remarks, Mark framed the case not merely as a personal fight for property rights, but as a critical stand against institutional corruption and the erosion of public trust in the land use system. His words resonated deeply in a courtroom already primed by weeks of mounting revelations. Judge Green, after a brief deliberation, issued his ruling from the bench. The court granted Sophia's petition to quiet title, affirming her legal ownership of the disputed land and ordering the correction of the official records to reflect the true boundaries. Moreover, he referred the matter of the ledger and related evidence to the district attorney for further investigation, citing the strong indications of criminal conduct. The ruling was a resounding victory, not just for Sophia but for the principle of legal accountability in the face of systemic abuse. As the courtroom emptied, Sophia allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The path to this point had been grueling, marked by personal attacks, professional risks, and the unrelenting pressure of entrenched opposition. Yet she had prevailed, not through spectacle or public outcry, but through disciplined legal strategy and an unwavering commitment to the truth. The battle was not yet over. The fallout from the ruling would reverberate for months, perhaps years, as further investigations unfolded and additional legal actions ensued. But the heart of the fight, the core question of her rightful ownership, had been decisively answered. Outside the courthouse, a throng of reporters awaited, their questions sharp and insistent. Sophia, true to form, kept her remarks brief and measured. Today's ruling affirms the importance of transparency and integrity in our land use system, she said. This case was never about personal gain. It was about ensuring that the rule of law prevails, even when powerful interests seek to obscure the truth. With that, she stepped away from the microphones, her focus already turning to the next phase of the battle. For while the courtroom fight had reached its climax, the broader war for justice and accountability in Maple Ridge was only beginning. In the weeks that followed Judge Green's ruling, the repercussions rippled swiftly through both legal and political circles. The quiet title judgment, now entered into the county record, secured Sophia's ownership beyond dispute. The official property maps were updated, and a public notice was issued by the county registrar, alerting all stakeholders to the corrected boundaries. The record correction alone sent a clear signal to the broader real estate community. The days of papering over Maple Ridge's fraudulent origins were finished. Title insurers began a comprehensive review of all subdivision lots, flagging those with discrepancies for further legal scrutiny. Several pending home sales were halted outright, and homeowners associations and neighboring developments scrambled to audit their own records, fearful of similar exposures. For the core figures behind the scheme, the fallout was immediate and severe. The district attorney, acting on Judge Green's referral, launched a formal investigation into the financial improprieties revealed in the developer's ledger. Search warrants were executed at multiple locations tied to the defunct development companies and their financial affiliates. Though some key players had long since distanced themselves from public involvement, the paper trail, painstakingly documented by Sophia's legal team, left little room for plausible deniability. Early indictments followed, including charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of public records, and bribery of public officials. The county's Internal Affairs Division, under intense public pressure, opened its own inquiry into the planning department's historical oversight failures. Marilyn's position within the Maple Ridge Association became untenable. Under mounting pressure from both residents and fellow board members, she resigned in a closed-door meeting less than a month after the court ruling. Her public statement framed the resignation as a personal decision, but insiders knew otherwise. Legal counsel had strongly advised her to step down to mitigate her potential liability as the broader investigation unfolded. In private, Marilyn reportedly expressed both anger and regret. Anger at those who had used her as a front for the deeper corruption, and regret for having underestimated Sophia's resolve. For Sophia, the period following the courtroom victory was no less demanding than the fight itself. Waves of new inquiries came from affected homeowners seeking guidance. Many were now confronting the unsettling realization that their properties might also rest on unstable legal ground. Sophia, while empathetic, remained clear-eyed. Her own case had been a personal battle for justice, not an open-ended crusade. She referred most inquiries to trusted colleagues while continuing to monitor the broader legal landscape. Meanwhile, Mark coordinated with state authorities as the investigation widened. It soon became evident that the Maple Ridge scheme was not an isolated event. Similar patterns of irregular subdivision approvals began to surface in other developments tied to the same network of developers and consultants. The State Attorney General's office moved to establish a special task force on land use corruption, a development that drew both public support and political controversy. Throughout all this, Sophia maintained her characteristic restraint. She declined multiple media invitations, preferring to let the legal outcomes speak for themselves. When pressed for comment, she reiterated a simple message. The integrity of property rights depended on transparent, lawful processes, and the community deserved nothing less. Privately, Sophia allowed herself a measure of quiet satisfaction. She had entered the battle with no illusions about its difficulty, nor about the forces aligned against her. That she had prevailed was a testament not only to the strength of her legal position but to the disciplined strategy she and Mark had executed from the outset. Yet she also understood that her victory came with broader responsibilities. The exposure of systemic corruption demanded continued vigilance, not just from legal professionals, but from citizens unwilling to accept the erosion of public trust in foundational institutions. In time, life began to return to a new equilibrium. The property itself, once shadowed by uncertainty, now stood as a symbol of resilience. Sophia moved forward with her original vision, initiating plans for a small, sustainable development aligned with community and environmental values. She met with county planners, new leadership now installed under public scrutiny, to ensure full transparency at every stage. The contrast between this process and the sordid history of Maple Ridge's original development was not lost on anyone involved. As winter gave way to spring, the first signs of renewal emerged. The legal reforms prompted by the scandal began to take shape. The county enacted stricter oversight requirements for future subdivisions, including mandatory third-party audits and enhanced transparency for public records. The state task force issued its first public report, outlining systemic vulnerabilities and recommending broader legislative action. Through it all, Sophia remained what she had always been, a practitioner of law committed to its highest purpose. She had not sought public acclaim, nor had she been driven by personal vendetta. Her fight had been one of principle, a defense of what the law was meant to protect. In that sense, her victory resonated far beyond the boundaries of her land. It served as a reminder that even in a system fraught with complexity and corruption, the rule of law, when wielded with clarity and courage, could still prevail. And so, as the final court orders were recorded and the headlines faded, Sophia looked ahead, not to new battles but to the steady work of building upon hard-won ground. The land was hers, lawfully and without contest. But more than that, the fight had reaffirmed a deeper truth, that justice, though often hard-won, remained within reach for those willing to pursue it with unwavering resolve.